Jennifer says,
Right, I'll just wait for Moira to admit the people in the waiting room. Good afternoon, everyone. I think we're just going to get started. We're going to crack on. We've got everybody here available, and we've got some people attending the workshop. It's great to see everyone here this afternoon. What we're looking at today is we're thinking about a workshop where we're exploring our barriers to collaboration. And this has come partly from my role as a program director in international development, and in the wake of calls to decolonize the curriculum and further calls to decolonize aid itself, and to think about what it is that actually causes barriers to our collaboration, to our communication. And I've been trying to think about the ways in which we can communicate with a broader range of stakeholders on a more equal basis. So I'm very grateful to have four discussants here who I'll be introducing to us all shortly. What I wanted to do to start with, however, is just to introduce a framework of analysis that I've been developing as a way of helping us think about these questions, a way of framing the questions about knowledge hierarchies and decolonization. The debate sometimes takes place in a bit of a dichotomous way, and I think it's time to sort of bring in a bit of more of a nuanced understanding in the way that we map stakeholders, understand where stakeholders are coming from and how they actually experience spaces of power, and what are the drivers that actually cause these different experiences of spaces of power. I'm going to see, if the technology doesn't let me down, if I can share my screen. So I'm hoping that you will be able to see this screen here where we've got a couple of diagrams. Now, this looks a little bit complicated to start with, and this is a suggested framework of analysis. So basically what we're looking at is the idea that we've got different types of stakeholders in both development and in development studies. Some of these are academic and some of these are not in the academic realm. So we've got this, as I was apologizing earlier about the rather clumsy shorthand of this being global north and global south. You know, this isn't always the easiest way of or the most truthful way of separating out actors, but it's just a shorthand to make sure that we are trying to understand differential impacts of power. Now, this section here, we're looking at whether or not stakeholders are academic stakeholders, and the professional knowledge is the knowledge that is seen as supplying sort of true and tested methods, accumulated bodies of knowledge, orienting questions and conceptual frameworks. And you have these multiple intersecting research programs that professional academic knowledge is based on. Critical academic knowledge questions the sort of fundamental foundations of this professional knowledge. It really thinks about the sort of research programs of the professional and thinks about the implicit and explicit foundations of where these programs have come from. And it also asks questions such as development studies for what, or development studies for whom. On the other hand, extra academic stakeholders, we see the policymakers and knowledge in the service of a goal defined by the client. So this is quite often knowledge for high-level actors or budget holders who think about what knowledge they need and what they would like to access, providing solutions for problems or trying to legitimate solutions. So what we have is this is just a step one where we think about where we fit as stakeholders. Of course, we might be a different stakeholder at different times, or experience multiple roles at the same time. But the next step is to think about how we experience spaces of power, whether or not they are open or closed to us, or anywhere in between, whether they are invited or claimed, or whether as a group we create a space. And then finally, the third step is to think about why this is the case, whether or not visible power is creating barriers or enabling us to access space. So that might be decision-making mechanisms, it might be formal institutions or laws. It could also be like economic power or even military might, this idea of visible power, something that is identifiable. We also have hidden power, which is where you have people shaping the political agenda behind the scenes. And this is very much about whether or not you can understand who is setting the agenda, or whether or not even the rules themselves or the institutions have been corrupted in some way. And then finally, we have invisible power, which is norms or belief, socialization, internalization of powerlessness. This is a very insidious form of power, where we feel as though we are accepting injustices as the normal order of things, or we're socialized into believing that we should behave in a certain way. Now, this is a very brief introduction to some big concepts, and this is purely a way of deciding whether or not this way of framing the questions that we're going to be looking at is helpful or not. So it might be helpful. Some people might think that it's not helpful, or that it needs to be adapted in some way. And I'm hoping this will be a very dialogic panel so that we can discuss these different issues and think about how we want to approach these. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And then I'm going to hand over to our speakers, who are going to briefly give an overview as to the main points of the information that they covered in the video beforehand. So we've got our 4 speakers. So we have Cherno Ba, who is the CEO of Purposeful in Sierra Leone, and he's giving us his insights on power imbalances in development and the decolonization of the aid agenda. So he's looking very much at the role of experts and knowledge holders in the development space, and offering ideas and insights about how we can balance this sort of northern and southern power in order to work more effectively together. We're then going to hear from Farida Benna, who has worked in high-profile development organizations and also runs a blog, Khaliza, Listening to Southern Citizens. And she is going to be making a very persuasive case for a joint degree in comparative development. We're then going to hear from Alexandre Chasson, who comes from the University of Oxford and has been working on a large GCRF funded research project. It's been an interesting experience. I've been working with him on it, and throughout the experience, he's been interviewing the multiple stakeholders within the project to ask about how they've experienced the power balances or imbalances between the different stakeholders. And these are stakeholders and actors from the global north and south. And then finally, we have Jennifer Lauren from New York University, who's going to share her experiences of looking at designing and implementing mentorship and curriculum, skills building initiatives, and cross-cultural working, and how this has worked in the academic space and the educational space. So as I say, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then I'm going to hand over to Cherno. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joe, and thanks for having me. Just to be clear, how many minutes do I have?
I think we have to be about 5 minutes max.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So I think as you said, I'm from Sierra Leone. The way I come into this conversation always is to, we talk a lot about decolonization. We talk about the aid industry, and industry itself that in my experience is so inherently imbalanced, right? And it's supposed to do good, but often does not ask itself the most critical and fundamental questions. We make so many assumptions about who has power, how power is kind of held and the relationships with power in that industry. And I start often by situating my own experience, right? I have a unique perspective in that I've been on many sides of the spectrum of the development industry. I was a child in war. I was a refugee. I was an activist. I was on those panels, the token young person on the panel that, was articulate and was the poster child of how this works. And then I became a development worker myself. I served in many humanitarian contexts around the world, and I got really upset and thinking this is really bad and I need to do something different about it, and set up Purposeful, which is an organization that seeks to recreate the world with and for girls, but really from a very intentional perspective of challenging the power paradigm and creating a new, essentially an aid industry, challenging the power structures that exist. And in the video, which some of you have seen, I tried, because every time we talk about this, sometimes people, people ask, well, what can you do about it? And that's what you were referring to in your framework, Joe, earlier on. It's the invisible power, right? We take all of these things for granted, but I tell a very simple story. Imagine that me, a Muslim African man, kind of encounters some money, and therefore I decide I'm going to go into the UK, and there's a community where there are some problems, and I'm going to save that community. I'm going to use my money to help transform that community. And I essentially import my staff, and they drive in SUVs. Well, the locals there, I pay them 5 times more than what we pay Sierra Leonean, what we pay folks in the UK. I come with a very clear model. I say, this is how it should be done. And by the way, it should be done in my language, using my M&E tools, using, and I will do spot checks as well. And just show up when you're not expecting me. And also you should perform when I show up. You should have the drums out, you should welcome me in my own culture and everything. And, I tell that story because I think it helps people to visualize just how absurd the current system is. We have internalized the system as it is the norm, but it's not. That development is not just one way. And that's what we're trying to do at Purposeful, is to challenge that paradigm. And I think one big way we do that, one way I like to talk about, is our relationship with money. Money is power. Who has access to money? What role does money play? Because the foundation of the global aid industry, in which kind of seeps through everything, is the idea that it is their money that they are giving to us, and that gives them power over us. And that's not true, right? You can question so much of that at different levels. And at Purposeful, we fund and give money to girls and girls groups, and we provide unrestricted resources to girls. And every time we say unrestricted resources to girls, people, their radars go up and ask about, but they talk about things like, the risk involved and things. And what we see instead is not just that girls are worth the risk, which is the response we have at Purposeful, but that actually when you give people access to money, they can chart their own cause. And they are allowed to fail, and that's okay, because failure is a right that's often reserved for people with privilege, and we want to challenge that paradigm as well. And we push back on all of that. And one final thing I'll say, I think my 5 minutes is up, is we have an organization that is global, proudly rooted in Sierra Leone, headquartered in Sierra Leone, with footprints in every corner of the world. Last year alone, we funded in over 190 countries around the world, but we're proudly headquartered in Sierra Leone. And that's important. And we have staff in about 8 countries now. And we don't have national and local staff and things like that. If you're in Sierra Leone, you're working for Purposeful, we treat you exactly the same way. And that's, again, challenging how the aid industry works, because, if you're in Sierra Leone, you're supposed to be treated less, you get paid less, versus if we will hire you in the UK, because somewhere we're accounting for standards of living. But obviously what constitutes standards of living as well right now are bias metrics, right? They don't take into consideration historical injustices, kind of the family responsibilities that I have that other folks will not have. I could go on, but I'm going to pause. And I hope that's, gets us going. Thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to everybody's talk as well.
Thanks so much, Cherno. It's just so many big ideas, but I love the way that you do it through turning it on its head. It's such a very illustrative way. You say so much with just that small example. Can't wait to share this with my students, because I think we're going to be starting the degree program from the beginning again. We'll have to turn it all on its head. So yes, we need more conversations about that. But that's really fantastic. Such powerful ways of thinking about things. So thank you so much. I'm going to then move swiftly on to Farida. So Farida, without further ado, move to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Joe. I mean, Cherno, you're a tough act to follow. I want to come work for you because you basically said it all and so beautifully, and you just give a different perspective to an issue that I myself have struggled with as an international development practitioner. Which is that even if you have the best intentions, if you want to decolonize aid, you, meaning in collective you, we find ourselves working in a sector that is grounded in so-called Western definitions, Northern definitions of what is a good practice, what is good development. What is best for developing countries, and that is also a definition I'm increasingly uncomfortable with. So a few years ago, a couple of years ago, right at the start of the pandemic, I wrote this blog post which continues, unfortunately, to be relevant to our situation as development practitioners. And in this blog post, I reflected on the fact that in the end, we do live through this invisible, hidden forms of power. I would say invisible power because collectively we have accepted and internalized that Northern academia, specifically Northern knowledge, is somehow better valued or valued as more beneficial and effective than Southern knowledge. So this is the reason why every year we see thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of students from the South going to or enrolling in Northern universities. The assumption there is that the degree they will get from a Northern university will be more useful, will lend them a better job than a degree sought at home. So academia really plays a key role even for practitioners. Those best practices are codified by academia into reports, evaluations, reviews, think piece that people, policymakers in donor agencies use to plan their funding strategies. So what you were saying, Cherno, about money and power, I mean, that's a key driver of everything we do in international development. So academia really plays an essential role. And if we want to decolonize aid, we have to question this architecture that puts Northern universities somehow on a higher level than Southern academia. So I looked into this issue, and I haven't been able to find a joint degree in international development. That's kind of curious to me. I found plenty of joint programs or initiatives where a Southern university is invited or collaborates with a Northern university. But at the end of the day, the student gets a degree, the actual diploma, from a Northern university. And the main reason why this is happening is because there is an issue with the accreditation system, which is hardly comparable between a Northern and a Southern university. So it's a bureaucratic hurdle that pretty much sort of confirms and perpetuates this inequality. But what if maybe a prestigious university from the global north, I don't know, Princeton or Harvard, were to partner with a southern university? I spoke with the dean of the International Development School at Makerere University in Uganda. What if they decided to pilot a joint degree that is granted by both universities at the same level? I think that would send a very strong message that northern and southern knowledge are equally valuable and worth learning from. But I've also written about the content of that degree. It's not just about a question of form or process, it's also the curriculum that needs to change. When I started in this career over 20 years ago, we pretty much only talked about overseas development. And this is changing, but the notion there that development is only needed overseas because here we already have it is in itself a flawed notion. And I think the response to the pandemic in different countries around the world has shown time and again that the usual suspects don't always have the best ways to intervene and respond to a pandemic. So I really hope, and I'm making the case in this blog post, that we move from studying international or overseas development to comparative development, which means comparing how different countries in the world, countries as diverse as Colombia, Ghana, Pakistan, the UK, have responded to a similar challenge such as the pandemic. That would be really interesting, and it will sort of level the field. To my knowledge, and I'll conclude with this one note, Joe, there's only one university in the world that has a specific joint degree program in local comparative development. It's based in Italy, but it only concerns universities that are based in the European Union. So it's an interesting model, an interesting approach. It would be great if we could use it and model it outside the European Union. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Farida. And that does sound interesting, actually. Oh, this is interesting. I think we'll be speaking with Annika after we've had the other introductions, because there's going to be some useful examples, I think, of maybe some other examples that people know of. But yeah, looking at that Italian one will be really interesting as well. I've been speaking to some colleagues, and I think there's potentially other things that we might be thinking about as well. So I'll just carry on with the last two introductions, and then Annika, it'd be really nice to be able to hear from you about that. It'd be fantastic. But before we do, I'll just move on to Alex, if that's okay, yes, to hear about your work. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, let me just start off by taking a step back and saying that I want to share a perspective from a different space where different but very similar narratives and dialogues take place, and that's in environmental policy. And I'm actually sitting right now in Oxford, and there is a conference called the Nature-Based Solutions Conference, and a lot of the discussions revolve around, sometimes implicitly or explicitly, about power imbalances. Whether it's with respect to funding, who decides the funding and who gets the funding, et cetera, as one example. So a lot of what Chernor was saying takes place in that space as well. And you might know that there were some very important negotiations last year in Glasgow, and there were important negotiations in Nairobi, which is the head of the UN Environmental Program, in the run-up to the Conference of the Parties for the Convention on Biological Diversity. So these points are relevant to environment and development as a whole. And for me, yeah, I'm Alex. I come from France. I'm French, but I've lived in the United States and other countries. And I've also traveled quite a bit. So just a tiny bit about me. If it's okay, I'm gonna share a couple of slides. And so first I want to talk a little bit about, so Sentinel. I'm not going to go over all of the findings. I'll just focus on the issue and the relations between, broadly speaking, the North and the South within the context of the Sentinel project, which had 5 or 6 partner organizations in the United Kingdom and partner organizations in Zambia, Ghana, and Ethiopia. And I'm going to recap some overarching challenges here. Sorry, one second. So I mean, there were challenges basically in establishing an equitable, balanced relationship. And I want to get into a little bit to explain, what are some of the key issues. There was recognition that project management tried to foster co-leadership, co-creation, but ultimately, based on these interviews I conducted with project participants from all of the countries I've mentioned, the research was seen as predominantly reflecting the interests of the UK, but even though the work was conducted in targeting policy in these 3 countries in Africa that I mentioned. I think that was one of the contributors to team building challenges. The funder, UKRI, really had an explicit interest in fostering these partnerships between the North and the South, but I think that this was challenged by these imbalances that I'm referring to. And what I referred to in the video, that the pre-recording, was that ultimately this challenges the project's overarching mission. Beyond partnerships creation, it challenges the process of what I refer to as transdisciplinary working, which includes working across disciplines, but for the specific purpose of influencing policy. So the project bridges the science and the policy realms, and it encompasses different bodies of knowledge beyond academia in order to shape policy that works. But the point I'm making here is that this imbalance challenges that very process. So what I would argue is that addressing the equity dimensions and power imbalances should not only be understood as a moral objective, but a necessary objective to achieve success in partnerships that attempt to do knowledge co-creation. I'll just show you one more slide, and I'll explain a little bit why I put that image there. This is, I want to talk to you a little bit about a policy brief, I hope I don't run over time, that I co-authored recently. I'll end shortly, directed to funders on how they can promote more equitable North-South partnerships. And if you scan the QR code, you'll get access to it. But I'll just point out here that I've highlighted some of the key points there. But before I get into it, I wanted to highlight that Cherno's presentation made me think of a movie which came out in France in 2006. The slide you see there, and it was intended to raise awareness on the situation of African refugees in Europe. And the long story is that the movie flips things upside down, and it shows Europe is struggling economically and politically, whereas in Africa, there are the United States of Africa, a thriving and affluent country. And so it puts you in this very same position that Cherno is trying to put us all in, to reflect on these things. And so I just felt like adding that. I'm running over time, so I won't really go into all the points I've highlighted there, but if you go into the brief, have a read, and these are specific recommendations for funders in terms of what they can do in order to promote more equitable partnerships. And first and foremost, it's about finding a different model than appointing the Northern institution as the lead, the Northern institution that is the only institution accountable to the funder. That was one of the core challenges. I'll stop there because I've run over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. That's really interesting. And yeah, I think there's some really useful stuff there in the brief here, where you're talking about the ways in which these balances, that even with the best will in the world, how a lot of, the combination of practicalities and even just from what we've been saying so far, and just thinking about that sort of the visible, hidden and invisible ideas, the thing that's really struck me just by what people have been saying is this key element of money. Even though we move beyond development, who has access to the visible power of money is so fundamental. But then also the sort of hidden aspect of trust in a way, you know, how we actually think about, you know, what we're trying to achieve and what we're trying to develop. And then finally, the sort of invisible aspect of attitudes, you know, this idea about, well, it's the northern one, so it's clearly, you know, it's sort of moving on all of these levels simultaneously, because it's not one or the other. Maybe we'll have time to discuss this. So before we move on, Jennifer, just really like to introduce you to everybody, and I'll hand over to you for a brief overview of your points. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to join this conversation today, and a lot of the key points from each of your presentations are things I'm really thinking about, and I'll just highlight some of the points that I went more deeply into during the video on this subject of creating a more equitable knowledge exchange. Two things that came to light. My current role, just to back up a moment, is in academia. I work as an educational designer, supporting faculty engagement across schools. But my previous experience was as an international development practitioner, working a great deal in the field on the design, delivery, and evaluation of education programs in often hard to reach, post-conflict, and marginalized communities. So I'm deeply informed by that experience, and want to just share some findings that I discovered from two regions I worked in, that I think there was some interesting practices in place that did lead to a local project in developing what could be phrased as a developing context, but where international cooperation was a big part of it. So one was in Jordan, an initiative aimed at addressing youth unemployment, and the other was in the western region of Ghana. Even though there's really a high rate of NGO presence in Ghana, this was in a region where there was no such availability and little to no access to schools and hospitals and other essential services. So in each that I found success was that there was it was built from on long-term trust and collaboration from the start. There was shared leadership. For instance, the initiative in Ghana was co-founded by a local elder and educator and a doctor from the West. The projects were based on a participatory decision-making model. The locals defined the problems and also played a hand in the solutions. There were very different contexts and agendas in each of these projects, but in both there was a high degree of co-creation. In the one in Jordan, aimed at kind of a holistic solution to youth unemployment. Youth and educators and all stakeholders in the region relevant to the education and employment literally created content, and the model itself was built to complement and not replace existing initiatives on the ground, rather than kind of come in with all the answers, which I think can be the case a bit with the NGO sector. So there was this culture of adaptability in both cases and active listening. Another, I would say, is multi-sector and multi-stakeholder engagement to address really complex problems. In the case of the Western region of Ghana, it was aimed at advancing the health, education, and livelihoods outcomes for marginalized youth. In the other, it was aimed at bridging the gap between education and employment. And so involved a real comprehensive all hands on deck solution with local actors to really address that in a fundamental way. I think that the themes coming up here today are really interesting around bringing it back to Turner's presentation around funding models, and kind of, if we don't address that, how can we really dismantle the current aid sector and move towards a more equitable knowledge economy and exchange exchange, I think, being the stress. And then also about failure. He mentioned failure, which I felt working in different, whether it be in multinational agencies or really small grassroots initiatives that reported back and, had funding relationships with development agencies of larger countries, there was a real apprehension to even discuss failure. But in these cases, I found there was that attempt, and we really framed it, I guess, as a communications challenge. We really framed it around how we responded. This is what we found, and this is how we responded. So we changed this education program to X, Y, and Z, and this is the outcomes that we're seeing. So making space for that, which I think can be in development and in development studies, and building those pathways, even within academia, of like intergenerational learning, I think, and where we sit, whether we're at the desk or in the field, I think really prioritizing that exchange, even within those ivory towers, I think would be really beneficial. And then finally, I think reflecting on stepping back and looking at how we can really re-envision research, implementation, and evaluation. And I think it's something that's in keeping with our chat today. And finally, bringing it back to funding, I just want to share one resource that I found valuable. And I think moving it towards more, I always want to move it less towards an obscure conversation about this, and then more what can be changed. And so I found this article in SSIR, the Stanford Innovation Review, really interesting about exactly addressing the funding problem and really reimagining the request for a proposal. And any of us that have worked in international development will know this. And so I found this really illuminating in kind of flipping the script on this and really inviting community co-creation from the beginning, and letting local communities really define the problems, and then we get there in terms of what international cooperation would look like. So that's something like moving from a transactional model more towards this shared knowledge exchange. So I'm interested to hear with your reactions, and I'll turn it back to you, Joe.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. That's really interesting. So, and again, lots of really fascinating points about something that comes out quite strongly, and I think from everybody in a way, is this notion of co-creation, and it's so important about sequencing. At what point co-creation comes into the conversation, and it's always too late. You see what I mean? It's never quite at the right time. So on that note, actually, I would like to take a step back myself as well, because I'm really interested. I can see it's lovely to have some people joining us as well, who I suspect potentially might have some knowledge about these different areas, or questions about the things that we've been sort of raising, that the people who've been speaking have been talking about. So I just wanted to make sure that I had a chance to throw the floor open to the people who are attending as well. So whether you want to put something in the chat or just come on mic to make a comment about anything that you've heard, or questions to either all or some of the panelists.
I can chip in if that's okay.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you so much for organizing this workshop. I'm really enjoying it, and I'm really glad I've been able to make it, because it was a bit touch and go. But it's really nice to find a group of people who are thinking through some of the same ideas that I'm interested in. So I really hope we can kind of continue these discussions somehow. That's always a bit of a challenge, how to continue the discussions going forward.
Yeah.
But I'd definitely be up for that if other people are. It was just about that, so that collaboration with SOAS and University of KwaZulu-Natal. I'm not involved or anything, but they did organize this event in February of 2021, Contested Spaces, that I shared. And it was the launch event for the collaboration. So it is definitely a sort of more ongoing thing. And it was a very nice event that was sort of very much organized between the two universities and had equal representation of people from the two universities. So I think they definitely are doing more deeper collaborations together over the long term. So yeah, it could be a useful one. I just wanted to say that I've recently gotten funding to do a postdoc at the Department of Conflict and Development Studies at the University of Ghent in Belgium to look into sort of decolonial approaches to social norms change. So very much, you know, these issues like child marriage and female genital mutilation and cutting. And so I'm very much into like decolonizing gender and development, decolonizing global health. So other people who are interested in those things, you know, I really like to connect. And I'm trying to work towards a definition or a working definition of decolonial social norms change interventions. And I found already this discussion really interesting because one of the criteria that I for the purposes of the project, developed a little definition of 4 criteria. But what I'd like to do over the course of the project is develop a kind of a collective definition with various people working in different capacities that could be sort of released as a policy brief or something to help you know, smaller organizations maybe lobby and say, look, this is what we would like in the direction of things to change. And one of the criteria was, you know, this that you mentioned, Jennifer, about a community level discussion of defining the problems and the solutions and collective implementation of those solutions. That was one of my criteria. So that was like, yeah, a nice connection. But all these issues about funding, I hadn't really thought through those things. So this whole discussion has really given me food for thought in terms of that. But yeah, I definitely like to keep these connections up to talk about those things going forward. So thank you very much, all of you. And I'll look at all your videos.
That's so great. Thanks, Annika. And I think I'll have to sort of find a way of making sure that we have maybe we have a very helpful, we have Monica, I think it is, who might be able to help me work out who's registered. Maybe I'll ask her before we all sign off if there's a way that we can collect, you know, the details of people who are on the chat for people who want to continue these conversations in the future, because I think these conversations about how we're defining decolonizing is everywhere. Everybody's talking about it, but if nobody knows what definition everyone else is using, you can be talking away and then you can be coming at it from completely different points of view with completely different aims and come for different audiences. But actually, a lot of these things are about fundamental power imbalances from the very beginning. And I think that's where we need to look at with a bit more of a nuanced lens and then really try and unpick some of these things that tend to be a bit sweeping statements, and those blunt instruments don't always help. And in fairness, they can actually sometimes pit people against each other in a way that's less helpful than when, you know, a very sort of collegiate way. I mean, everybody on the panel who's been brilliant and said, yeah, they'd come and speak on the panel, all share this attitude of building something up rather than sort of tearing it apart and working collectively. It's been such a wonderful group of people to be speaking with. So yeah, absolutely, we'll make sure that we share context. But I think Remy, you had your hand up next, and then Farida, and then Alex. So Remy, it's great to have you on the call. So do come on, Mike.
Good afternoon or good morning to everyone.
Hi.
I'm Remy. I'm from UCL. I'm a PhD student. This discussion is really fascinating and enlightening. I'm really learning a lot, and so educating. I had just a couple of questions. One from to Cherno Ba, if I pronounce your name correctly, my brother, and then Alex. For Cherno, I think the approach you have decided to take is really, life-changing, and you're changing the dynamics and the paradigm, the kind of that paradigm shift in the way the systems have been structured. Then my question is around whether or not you have come across any challenge from within, because we are talking about power dynamics. We are comparing, the north and south, and in this case we are talking about Africa, but still we are dealing with the human beings primarily, the society, and within the society there are always those power dynamics. So now, in your new way of doing, have you ever encountered any problems of power dynamics from within Africa? Because I learned from this morning, one of the sessions this morning, around the issue of, in Africa particularly, where one of the reasons why we see this imbalance of the perpetual issue of decolonization not moving as the way people think it should be is mainly partly because within African actors, that a few elites are kind of adapting the colonial legacy towards their counterpart. I mean, toward the rest of the society. So it would be interesting to hear from your experience whether you have come across such challenge. Then, if you allow, I would go to Alex. Alex, I liked your presentation because it resonates very well with the work I'm doing. I'm working on my PhD, which is to do with understanding the interactions among actors for innovation and technology development. I want to just ask a quick question around what you, from your projects, how we came about with the conclusion or the issue of individual competences, from those individual competences as some of the drivers for power dynamics. You alluded to the issue of actors being required or having to understand other actors. So I wanted to know whether that issue is to do with capacity, individual capacity, or whether it was just driven by the hidden powers, or whether it's just the issue of capacity, and if the issue in whichever way, whether it is just both for the actors in Africa or the actors in the UK. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll let Cherno go first
then. Of course, there are multiple challenges, and yes, I mean, I think there are two major challenges in my work. We're trying to were two of the biggest issues we're trying to deal with. You think about the patriarchy, you think about colonialism, and in each of those, I always say that an ism works well when the victims of that system become the purveyors of that system. So oftentimes what you see is the people who are most defending the system are the people who suffer from it. So it's not just the elite, it's the way we're socialized, right? You take global aid, like the narrative around it has been so taken for granted that it's unidirectional, that expertise and resources come from one way onto the other, that we're just recipients, the structures are really set. And even when we try, even amongst the NGO community, when we try to push back, we're having these conversations, we get a lot of pushback from our own friends and and they're talking about even paying our colleagues well. One of the biggest concerns is we're going to disrupt the NGO field. And I was like, we actually are intentional about wanting to disrupt. This is the point of it. We don't exist to maintain the status quo. Our ambition is actually to overturn the status quo. So I think our attitude to all of these challenges, we always talk about grace in the work that we do, understanding where people are and how they got to where they are. People are not bad or evil. They've been socialized in a certain way. And the systems that socialize us are very powerful. They're invisible. They've kind of taken over our lives. So it's constant engagement. It's, as you were saying, Joe, it's about showing and building. It's not destroying anybody. It's demonstrating that we can do this different. We're all victims, we're all survivors, including, by the way, people who work for big institutions like FCDO, who are like massive in this infrastructure that we talk about. They're not bad people. The individuals who sign up to work in these spaces, they actually mean well, but they are socialized into thinking the way they do it is the only way that it must be done. The tools that they come with are the only tools. And they are shocked when we tell them, oh my God, no, like we don't believe in that. We don't agree with that. And the final thing I would say is the biggest liberation for folks working in this field is when they are aware that they don't have to say yes to all money, because what they use to subject us is money, right? It's, the thing you shared about call for proposals. So the entire industry is shaped by where the money is. So they're calling for a proposal where our organization shifts to them. And then we have to meet all these ridiculous criteria, subject ourselves to all these things. And we're saying that one of the things we're beginning to do is to organize other NGOs, other local organizations, and be like, if you want to work with us, because it is a partnership, here are the simple principles and values. We will not do things in this way. We're not going to like put ridiculous conditions on people's ability to cover overheads, because people have to live and survive. Those are the things. It's very dehumanizing set of conditions that we're used to accepting because we don't understand that we have power. And what we're seeing very quick, excuse me, is that once we band together and say, hey, these are our standards, these are the things we want, quickly these international institutions are adapting. So yes, we do have a lot of challenges, but we think about it as a long-term proposition. So we keep at it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was, if I may, I'm just gonna follow up on that and then answer Remy's question following. But I want to give you I want to come in again with a perspective from these environmental policy spaces which are intersecting with international development. I fundamentally, I see the same issue that Cherno mentioned, that this power imbalance that's created with an imbalance in wealth. And it makes me think of the work of Jason Hickel, an anthropologist and economist, who quantified that for every dollar of aid that flows to the quote unquote global south, about 3 flows out. And they've actually come up with a study last year that showed that since 1960, I think about $60 trillion US, more than that has flowed to the north. So it's very concerning, and I just wonder the extent to which we can actually fully implement decolonization without in that space. And again, from the environmental policy space, I can say that there are on paper clear efforts to change these practices and ways of doing, whether it's for finance or how to implement projects. So for example, the IUCN, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, has a standard which was co-designed with its members, which states that the first principle is this is in the conservation and environmental space. The first principle is you design the solution around the needs and concerns of the local community, but the reality on the ground can be very different. Well, because so anyway, it's very complicated to figure out what are the right mechanisms across contexts to ensure that this is that what's on paper is actually followed. So I'm just keen to learn more about experiences from international development to bring that into my space. And then in terms of Remy's question, I think the question is about, if I'm not mistaken, is the emphasis on, in relation to what to do about these power dynamics, is the emphasis on individual competencies or perhaps the competencies of organizations or what we would refer as institutional capacities? I think it's all of the above. In our focusing in on Sentinel, what I emphasize in some of the recommendations, which I'm trying to finalize, is there is absolutely a need to focus on individual competencies, but in a broad sense, not just technical skills, of course, but like the ability to step back and critically reflect on the situation, understand one positionality, understanding how to dialogue across cultures. There's a whole range of individual level competencies which are important to create spaces that give voices for all actors that are involved in the project. And in terms of critical, the ability to reflect critically, I think there is one of the issues is that there are disciplines where things are just not taught that way, basically. So the natural sciences, that's not something that a natural scientist like an ecologist is used to doing, generally speaking. And so there are some challenges there. I'm just picking any colleges, not to single them out, but just as an example, right? Knowing how to do these things, yeah, it doesn't come in, it's not first nature to many people. And then, but there are, I think, things that one can do above the level of individual competencies in order to influence how the projects are designed and managed and operated. So how do you create the spaces that give people voices? What do you need to do? Yeah, that's so. And then in terms of then the higher order is organizational competencies. So processes and structures within organizations like the University of Oxford. You know, how to create the right form of partnerships. How do you create, for example, exchange programs that are two ways, you know, and that step outside of this idea of, oh, the North knows and we need to build the capacity of the other. No, it's not like that. So, and then the institutional level is where that brief I mentioned comes into play. So that's what do the funders need to do in order to create funding mechanisms that bridge, that address these power imbalances. And I'll just go back to, I wanted to give one example from Sentinel. This is more at the organizational level, and I won't name the university, but there was, because actually I think it applies to many universities, but in the United Kingdom and in many universities in the North, there are very structured, defined processes for ethics approval. Obtaining ethics approval, you need to do this and this and that, right? Okay, fine. It sounds great on paper. We obviously want to avoid unintended consequences and so forth. I'll stop after this example. But the point is that we had partners in Southern universities, and they had their ways of doing, but they felt constrained by that requirement, because whenever a researcher from that said university in the UK was involved, it had to be under those conditions. So it created a challenge and a feeling of, okay, that means you don't trust what we're doing, basically, if you get me, right? So that we understand that's not the intention, but that's how it's perceived. So yeah, that's just an example of a challenge at the organizational level. And anyway, I've been talking too much, so I'll stop. Thank you.
Farida's got her hand up, so I shall go to her. I'll just very briefly say that I think this issue of trust is really important, and that's the difficulty, is that as soon as we move from a one-to-one individual relationship any bigger, you know, but then certainly to a bigger organization, and universities are like oil tankers trying to turn them around. They're such big organizations, and so developing relationships of trust is very difficult, because you can know somebody on a personal basis and feel perfectly comfortable, know where they're coming from, and then the more the layers of bureaucracy sort of fill in the gaps between personal relationships, the harder it becomes. But Farida, I'll just hand over to you now.
Just a 1-minute comment on what Jennifer and Anneke were saying earlier in terms of co-creation, and also what you just mentioned about trust. Co-creation, relationships, trust, they all take time. And in our world, the time is money, which is why you don't see a lot of donors designing their requests for proposals the way we would like to. So I think the key is to find the progressive donor, and there are some out there, public and private, that is willing to take a chance and invest a few months and the corresponding budget in allowing us to co-create and build those relationships. I mean, we could pilot, we should prove that this different approach delivers a better result. The second point I wanted to make is that, yes, we could come together and try to come up with a definition of decolonization. I personally have tried to do that on many other key concepts, and my advice would be to avoid waiting until we all agree on a definition, because that's going to easily take a decade, especially on such a sensitive issue as aid decolonization. Definitions are often used as the perfect excuse to dodge the bullet or postpone an important policy discussion. So I'm not saying we should ignore this important debate, but let's not wait until we have the perfect definition before tackling the issue of decolonization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farida. Yes, I think that's very true. I mean, I suppose it's difficult because this is where we come from different points of in that I become, maybe it's just me, you know, where I'm coming from, because I come very nervous when people sort of move forward before the definition is there. But then it's exactly right, that can itself prove an obstacle. I like sort of clarity about what it is we're trying to achieve, but then that can be, you know, the sort of difference between the praxis and the theoretical approach. And some of us probably are more comfortable sitting in this theoretical space, and then sort of like being pushed out of our comfort zone to think, well, this has to be achieved even if you are still trying to define terms. I think this has been really very interesting, and I'm sorry that it is a very short space of time, actually. I mean, if anybody's not rushing off, then I know I'm certainly happy to be here for another 15 minutes or so. I know that, yeah, I know Alex is in the middle of another conference. There's lots of other things going on at the moment, but I hope everybody will be able to see what my email is. I think it's on, you know, on the panel, and so everybody can just, if anybody's keen to carry on the conversation. I know I'm in touch with the panelists, and we're looking at the interesting thing is we've got different threads of the conversation going in different directions, and I know we're trying to cover quite a lot here, and so the idea of the very sort of educational curriculum space, as well as the broader research space and the broader actual practitioner space. But I think it's really interesting to have these conversations together at the beginning, because actually what we're trying to teach in development studies ends up being what people who go on to work in, you know, in different development spaces are actually going to be thinking when they, you know, it's like when people saying, gosh, it really turns, you can have things turned on its head, and you've always been taught, well, yes, we're there to go and help people and save all these people, overseas development, you know, overseas help the people there. And so I think if those of us who are involved in designing curricula for development studies students are having these conversations and actually wanting to expose our students right at the beginning, they walk into our universities, and it's just like Cherna was saying, very generously saying, you know, it's not that they're doing it with bad intentions. They really are, you know, there's some wonderful, lovely students who come in with very good intentions of seeing injustice and wanting to challenge it. But it is this exact problem where if you don't think about this in terms of power imbalances and how the power is distributed, if you don't have that clear in your mind at the beginning, then you can end up exacerbating, embedding, and really strengthening these power imbalances in a way which is the exact opposite of what it is we're trying to achieve. So like I say, I'm really sorry that this is coming to a close. We're all going to be carrying on with these discussions. So it would be lovely if anybody who would like to drop me an email, then I can have a sort of, I don't know, we can all do LinkedIn or something, and I'm not the best with technology at the best of times, but you know, if we're publishing on these things or working or trying to work together, I think it would be brilliant to have this community growing, because I know that I've been talking to a lot of people who are really thinking about these questions. So if there's thank you everyone, thanks. I'm just half looking at the chat while I chat on, but it's been really lovely to make connections here. I'm going to just very briefly, if anybody had a final point before we sign off, but in the absence of that, like I say, do drop me an email and I can try and keep the conversation going. I think, yeah, I think that's it's been great, and thank you so much to the panelists and to the respondents as well, the people who are attending for their contributions. Oh, thank you for the applause, Rika. That's
yeah,
great.
thank you for organizing, Joe.
Thank you so much, everyone. Yeah,
Thank
such brilliant people to bring together. It's been my privilege. So thank you so much.
I'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, guys. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.